What 3 of Canada's most decorated neurologists had concluded across 31 months, Malcolm Briggs determined in under 2 minutes. He was pushing a mop cart through the service corridor of the Fairmont Royal York at the time, and nobody in the ballroom would have looked at him twice. The Hartwell Pharmaceutical's annual leadership dinner occupied the hotel's main ballroom on the 4th Thursday of October, the way it had every year for 11 years. 600 people in black tie, open bar, 4 courses, and a keynote address from Edwin Hartwell on the company's pipeline for the coming fiscal year. Malcolm had worked this event 3 times before. He knew where the caterers staged the 3rd course and which table was closest to the service door he wasn't supposed to use. He moved through the room the way men in gray shirts are expected to move, efficiently, quietly, without eye contact. He was 52 years old. Before the hotel, he had spent 14 years as a psychiatric nurse at Toronto Western, most of them on the unit that handled complex diagnostic cases, the ones where the first 3 diagnoses hadn't worked and the family was starting to understand what that meant. He had left 8 years ago, after Ruth died, because the building had too many corridors that smelled like the one he'd spent the last 17 months of her life walking. Ruth had been misdiagnosed. That was the plain version of it. The longer version was that a physician she trusted had prescribed a compound intended to slow a cognitive decline that she did not, in fact, have, and the compound had produced the symptoms it was meant to prevent. And by the time Malcolm understood what he was looking at, the window had closed. He had known for 4 months before anyone believed him. He had the files to prove it and no remaining use for them. His daughter Sophie was 24 and in her 2nd year at McMaster's Medical School. The gap between what Sophie's scholarship covered and what the program actually cost was $11,000 a year. Malcolm covered it with shifts. Night work paid more, which was why he was at the Fairmont at 9 in the evening on a Thursday in October instead of somewhere else. Edwin Hartwell arrived at the dinner at 7:15 with 2 board members, an assistant, and his son. Malcolm noticed the son because he did not fit the room the way the others did, not by age. There were younger people in the ballroom, but by the quality of his attention. Adrian Hartwell was 28. He had worked as an operations analyst at the company for 2 years before the episode started. He was sitting at table 14 against the east wall, and he was engaged with the conversation around him in a way that was careful rather than easy, the way a person is careful when they are working harder than the room can see. 3 years earlier, a team of neurologists coordinated by Dr. Julian Pemberton had diagnosed Adrian with moderate early-onset cognitive impairment. The diagnosis had been reviewed twice and confirmed both times. Adrian could not reliably retain new information across a 24-hour period. He lost the thread of conversations. He misplaced things he had set down seconds before. He had been, before all of it, the sharpest person in most rooms he entered, and that information now served mainly as a reference point for how far he had fallen. Pemberton had managed the case since the 4th month. He directed a private cognitive health institute in North Toronto, and the Hartwell Foundation had funded 2 research chairs there in the 18 months following Adrian's diagnosis. He was silver-haired, measured, and had a gift for explaining complicated medical realities in a way that closed the conversation rather than opened it. Cecily Dodd had been hired as Adrian's full-time caregiver 34 months ago. She had come through a recruitment firm, arrived with strong references, and within 6 weeks had become indispensable in the way that people become indispensable when they are the only consistent presence in a difficult situation. She knew Adrian's medication schedule, his triggers, his bad mornings, and his better afternoons. She sat half a table away from him tonight with a small cooler bag under her chair. Preston Haig had been with Hartwell Pharmaceuticals for 12 years, first as a senior vice president, then as chief financial officer. He had an instinct for materialization. He appeared precisely when appearing was useful, which was often in Edwin's vicinity and never accidentally. Malcolm was clearing a trolley of water glasses near the service alcove at 8:40 when Cecily opened the cooler bag and removed a small glass bottle and a pill organizer. She did it the way someone does something they have done hundreds of times, without looking, without pausing the conversation she was half-tracking, with the efficiency of complete familiarity. She poured the liquid into Adrian's water glass and set the pill organizer beside his bread plate. Adrian took the pills without looking at them and drank. Malcolm kept moving. He had learned to count time without checking his watch, a habit from the unit. 22 minutes after Cecily's glass hit the table, something changed in the quality of Adrian's attention. It was not a gradual drift. Malcolm had watched genuine cognitive decline often enough to know what gradual looked like. This had a timestamp. Mid-sentence, Adrian stopped. He looked at the man across from him as though the conversation had occurred in a different room. He picked up his fork and set it down and looked at his hands. Malcolm had seen that quality of shift before, not in a ballroom. In a hospital room on the 4th floor of Toronto Western, in a woman who trusted a prescription she had been given by someone she trusted, and who lost 17 months of her life to it before the window closed. He finished the trolley, moved it to the staging area, and stood in the service corridor for 45 seconds with his hands in his pockets. Then he went back in. Adrian was in the hallway near the coat check at 9:15, looking at a framed photograph on the wall. He was reading the caption beneath it. His lips were moving slightly. When Malcolm came even with him, Adrian looked up and met his eyes the way people do when they are actually present, not lost. Malcolm had his phone in his hand. He angled the screen light toward Adrian at close range, close enough to read pupil response. Bilateral constriction. Symmetrical and defined. That did not happen with structural memory impairment. It happened with cholinergic disruption, and it was the same thing he had seen in Ruth's eyes 4 months before her last decline, in a corridor that smelled the same as this one. "Mr. Hartwell," Malcolm said. He kept his voice flat. "Do you remember who sat across from you at dinner?" Adrian looked at him carefully. "Graham Yee. He runs acquisitions for the Western Division. He's been with the company since before I started. He has a daughter at UBC and he's worried about interest rates." There was nothing wrong with the memory. Nothing at all. Finding Edwin Hartwell at 9:45 cost Malcolm a short argument with an event coordinator and a longer one with 2 members of the hotel security team that Haig had arranged. He reached Edwin in the foyer outside of the coat check, between a donor conversation and a car that was waiting. Edwin turned with the patience of a man who was stopped 20 times a night at events like this. "Your son doesn't have memory loss," Malcolm said. "He has something in his system that's preventing new memories from forming. There's a difference, and it matters, and the difference shows up in his pupils." Edwin did not respond immediately. The patience lasted longer than most people's patience would have, which told Malcolm something about the man. "Who are you?" Edwin said. "Facilities. Temp tonight." He did not decorate it. "I was a psychiatric nurse for 14 years. I've seen this pattern, not in a textbook, in my wife." 3 neurologists, Edwin said. 2 independent review panels. "I know, and I'm telling you to ask Pemberton one question before you get in that car. Ask him whether he has ever run a toxicology screen on Adrian's supplements independently of the neurological panels. Not alongside, separately. Ask whether those supplements have ever been tested by a lab with no existing relationship to his institute." Preston Haig arrived at Edwin's right shoulder. Malcolm recognized the move. He had 3 minutes, if that. "Ask whether the episodes have a consistent interval after his evening dose," Malcolm said, faster now but not louder. "Ask whether the first episode occurred within 3 months of starting the supplement protocol Pemberton prescribed. Because structural cognitive impairment doesn't have a pharmacokinetic signature. What I watched happen to your son tonight at 9:02 does." Haig said something about the car and the schedule and the photographer waiting near the stage. Edwin had not moved. "If you're wrong," Edwin said quietly. He was not asking a question. "Then I'm a hotel worker who interrupted your evening to tell you your son is being poisoned. You can fire the temp agency." "And if you're right." Malcolm did not answer that. He handed over his phone with the photo he had taken in the corridor. Adrian's pupils, time-stamped, with the supplement administration time he had recorded from memory written beside it. Edwin looked at the photo for a long moment. He handed the phone back. Then he looked across the foyer to where Adrian was standing with Cecily near the coat room door, and something in his face shifted in the way things shift when a person allows themselves to consider a possibility they have worked very hard not to consider. Your name, Edwin said. Briggs, Malcolm Briggs. Edwin nodded once. He got in the car without looking at Haig. Malcolm finished his shift. He was out by midnight. On the drive home along the Gardner, he ran the arithmetic he always ran on the way home from a gala shift. $11,000 a year, divided by the number of hours in a week that were available to him. It had been the entire shape of his life for 2 years, and it had the same clean answer it always had. He did not know yet that Edwin Hartwell had, before his car reached the driveway of his house in Rosedale, called a toxicologist at the Hospital for Sick Children, who had no connection to Pemberton's Institute, and asked her to come to the house in the morning. The analysis took 11 days. The toxicologist ran 3 independent panels on 6 months of Adrian's supplement supply. What she found was not on any label, and had not been disclosed to any of the 3 reviewing neurologists, because what she found was not a pharmaceutical product. It was an experimental cholinergic pathway inhibitor, a compound Owen Burton had co-authored a paper on 7 years earlier in a journal that had since ceased operation. The compound did not destroy memory. It disrupted the encoding process, the narrow window in which new experience becomes stored information. With it in his system, Adrian's brain received everything and retained almost none of it. Without it, there was no structural reason his memory would not function. That was the first layer. The second layer came from a forensic accounting firm Edwin retained quietly, through outside counsel, 2 weeks after the toxicology results. The compound had a batch designation traceable to a subsidiary research lab that Hartwell Pharmaceuticals had absorbed 4 years earlier. The subsidiary had produced 8 experimental batches of the compound over a period of 30 months. 6 of those batches were unaccounted for in the lab's inventory. Pemberton's Institute had presented Adrian's case as its anchor longitudinal study in 2 separate funding applications. The permanence of Adrian's condition was the cornerstone of both. One application had succeeded, the other was pending. Cecily Dodd had been placed through a recruiting firm whose principal had a prior professional relationship with Preston Haig. Over 31 months, she had rescheduled 4 of Adrian's independent consultation appointments, each time shifting to a different facility and a different technician, breaking the chain of records that might have produced a cumulative picture. While Edwin's attention had been divided between running a publicly traded company and managing his son's irreversible condition, Haig had been present at 11 board votes that shaped the company's acquisition strategy. He had been the deciding voice in 3 of them. 2 acquisitions had been structured through entities in which Haig held a minority interest through a numbered corporation registered in Alberta. Edwin read the accountant's summary on a Sunday morning and sat at his kitchen table for 22 minutes without touching his coffee. He gave outside counsel a single instruction: build all of it and don't file until I say. Adrian came off the supplement compound on the 18th day after the toxicology results. The first week was disorienting in a way that had its own particular cruelty. He knew his memory worked, and he could not yet trust that knowledge because he had spent 31 months being told by people with credentials that it didn't. The second week was better. The third week, he remembered a conversation he'd had with a hotel maintenance worker in a foyer 3 weeks prior and asked his father who that man was and how to reach him. Malcolm came in on the 29th day. What followed was not rehabilitation in any formal sense. He had described it to Edwin simply as the part that happens when no one is watching, the hours between assessments when the work is done not by protocol but by presence. He had learned what that looked like in a house on Bloor Street West over 17 months with Ruth, and it had not saved her, and it had turned out to be the only thing he knew how to teach. By December, the pattern was visible. Adrian's recall on structured assessments had moved from a spaceline of 14% to 63%. The independent evaluator noted the result, and then noted it again in her written report, because there was no published literature against which to compare a recovery of this speed in a case with this history. The literature assumed the damage was real. In this case, it had not been. Preston Haig moved in January, which was later than Malcolm had expected and earlier than Edwin's counsel had hoped for. He brought a formal governance complaint to the board's audit committee. Edwin had installed an unlicensed individual in a position of daily contact with a family member without board disclosure. Every fact in the complaint was accurate. The framing was a different matter. The committee convened on the second Wednesday of February in a boardroom on the 31st floor. Edwin was present but recused from the vote because the audit committee's charter required it when the chief executive was personally implicated. He sat against the wall and said nothing until it was time. Haig opened with the same unhurried tone he used for quarterly reports. No degree, no clinical registration, no formal disclosure to the board. First contact established with the affected family member in an unsupervised hotel corridor while employed as temporary facilities labor. He asked the committee to sit with the liability exposure. He used the word exposure 4 times. Malcolm sat where he was told to sit. He had brought a binder. He left it closed on the table until the committee chair, Francis Okafor, asked him to speak. "I'm not going to argue the credentials question," he said. "Everything he said about my qualifications is accurate. I don't have the letters." He slid the binder toward Okafor. "What I have is 31 days of daily session logs, countersigned every other week by Dr. Anita Shah, who is on the independent panel and has no prior relationship with anyone in this room." He did not editorialize. He let the numbers stand. Haig said that positive results did not address the exposure question, and that an outcome obtained through an unqualified channel was still an unqualified channel. He said it with the calm of a man who had used that sentence before. Edwin spoke from the wall. He had been quiet for 50 minutes, which the room had noticed. "I had 3 neurologists," he said, 2 independent review panels, 47 pages of imaging reports I never read myself because I trusted the man who described them to me. He did not raise his voice. I had a security team that nearly had Malcolm removed from that foyer. I had 31 months during which the word irreversible appeared in every conversation I had about my son, and I accepted it because the people saying it had more credentials than I thought to question. He paused. He had a phone camera in 2 minutes. I know which one of those is the embarrassing part. The committee chair called the roll. It stood 4-2 for suspension after 6 names. The 4 remaining members included 2 who had already indicated privately they would follow Haig's lead and 2 who had voted with him in November. Nobody had expected what happened next because nobody had known Adrian was in the building. He came through the door at the back of the room without knocking. He was not carrying anything. He had not been invited, and he had come anyway because Malcolm had told him 3 days earlier that the hearing was scheduled and that he did not have to attend but that he could, and Adrian had thought about it for 2.5 days and then decided. He stood near the door and looked at his father, and the room went quiet in the way. Rooms go quiet when something is about to happen that cannot be taken back. "I want to say something," Adrian said. "I'd like the minutes to reflect that I'm saying it without notes." Francis Okafor nodded. Adrian was quiet for a moment. Then he recited the first 2 minutes of the keynote speech Edwin had delivered at Adrian's university convocation 9 years earlier, not paraphrased, not summarized, word for word, with the same 3-beat pause Edwin had used before the closing line, the one that had drawn applause from a room of 2,000 people. He had heard that speech once, at 23 years old, and he had not forgotten it, because his memory had never been broken. It had only been blocked. When he finished, the room did not move. "My name is Adrian Hartwell," he said. "For 31 months I was told I couldn't reliably hold a new memory for 24 hours. I could. I always could. I'd like the record to show the difference between those 2 things, because they are not the same thing, and the people in this room have spent the last hour deciding whether the man who noticed that difference should be allowed to keep working." Francis Okafor took 4 minutes before she called the remaining names. When she did, the last 4 members voted against suspension. The motion failed, 6-4. The filings went out the following Monday. Pemberton's license was suspended pending investigation in March. The co-authorship on the compound's original research paper made the concealment deliberate rather than negligent in the regulatory board's assessment, and once that determination was entered into the record, the professional proceedings moved faster than the civil ones. His institute's funding partners withdrew within the week. Cecily cooperated under proffer. She gave investigators the name of the individual who had recommended her for the position, the reason behind each rescheduled appointment, and the amounts and routing of payments that had moved through an unrelated consulting entity for 31 months. Haig resigned in March, citing personal commitments. The resignation prevented nothing. The shareholder suit was filed within 6 weeks and was still in discovery the following winter. The numbered Alberta corporation took 4 months to fully untangle. Edwin kept the chief executive position by a margin that surprised people who had been counting votes. The program Malcolm had been running from the room off Edwin's kitchen was formalized in April. 3 patients in addition to Adrian, all referred by Dr. Shah's independent panel. Malcolm was named program director. He completed a rehabilitation aid certification in February to hold the title, and the credential felt beside the point in the way credentials sometimes do when they arrive after the work has already been done. By summer, Adrian was at 89% on standardized recall measures, which his evaluator noted was above the population mean for adults his age, without any history of cognitive disruption. He enrolled in a graduate program in the fall. He had kept a handwritten journal through the 31 months of his illness, not because anyone told him to, but because he had understood instinctively that if his memory was going to be unreliable, he would make it reliable by other means. And he went back through it in August with a kind of forensic attention, reading his own entries as evidence of what had been taken from him, month by month, and what he had managed to hold on to anyway. Sophie finished her second year at McMaster in April and came home for the summer, and the $11,000 gap that had been the arithmetic of Malcolm's life for 2 years stopped being a problem in a way that took him several months to actually believe. He deposited the first check 3 times before he was convinced it had cleared. He thought about Ruth differently now. 17 months of a house that was too quiet, a medication journal he had kept in pencil, and a window that had closed before anyone with the authority to open it decided to look. Those 17 months had produced nothing that anyone would have called a result. They had turned out to be the only training that mattered. He had spent years treating them as something that had happened to him. They were the thing that made him useful. The program's permanent home opened in September in a clinic space Edwin funded through a restructured foundation. Dr. Shah ran the clinical oversight. Malcolm ran the daily protocols. There were 9 patients enrolled by October, all of them with histories that had something in common. They had been told, by credentialed people, that what their own bodies kept insisting was wrong. Some of them had believed, all of them had learned to distrust the one instrument of evidence they had actually been given, themselves. At the opening, Edwin gave brief remarks he had written without notes. I had access to every resource available, he said. I did not use the one that would have mattered, which was my own judgment applied to a question I was afraid to ask. A man with a mop cart and a phone camera asked it for me. I don't say that as a nice story about unlikely heroes. I say it because I think we have built entire systems around the comfort of deferring difficult questions to people with the right titles, and those systems have a cost that never appears on a balance sheet. Malcolm was at the back of the room with a paper cup of coffee, going over the week's session logs. He did not make a speech. Later in the corridor, Edwin stopped beside him. She had the same look, Edwin said quietly. Adrian, in the foyer that night. The same look he had when he was 20 and had just figured something out. I know, Malcolm said. How did you know it mattered? In the corridor. You could have kept walking. Malcolm thought about a hallway at Toronto Western and a woman reading a menu in the last good year and a physician who had seen what he wanted to see and closed the file. He thought about what it costs to be right when no one believes you and what it costs more to stay silent. I'd already kept walking once, he said. It didn't work out. Edwin nodded. He walked back toward the room. The hard thing about seeing clearly, Malcolm had come to understand, was not the seeing. It was the standing still in the moment after, when every reasonable calculation told you to move on, and choosing not to. Not out of courage, he had never found it useful to call it that, but out of the plain recognition that some things once noticed cannot be quietly set aside without a cost that compounds in ways no one bothers to measure until it is too late. Nobody needed a title for that. They only needed to have already paid it once.